So a little bit about myself. I started off in finance and accounting, and again, if you've heard me talk before, you've heard this, but I basically tried to figure out how to do my job because I hated it so much. And I did that for about 2 years until I realized that I was in the wrong field. And I moved in to more of an IT kind of field like this, but I support finance and accounting. And I've got that background so I can talk on both sides. So I don't have any training, any formal training in Java or Groovy or .NET or even Essbase or planning. It's all self-taught. So I'm sure that there are a few people in here that probably know far more than me about Java and probably about Groovy. If there's anything that I say that's inaccurate, you're more than welcome to correct me for the sake of everybody in here trying to learn this stuff. If you want to get a hold of me, I run the Into Hyperion blog, if you've ever used that, and some of the younger people probably didn't know it existed, but a lot of the people that have been in the space for 5 or more years use the ribbon, the Into Hyperion ribbon that was used to use the Essbase add-in and the ribbon bar, so that was all me. You can also sign up at Into Hyperion, or you can follow the group on LinkedIn. And I don't market it, I don't put anything from here on or anything like that. It's all just when I post a new article, you guys get notified. So if you're curious and you want to stay up to speed on what I post, you're more than welcome to sign up at one of those places. So Groovy, an introduction. Oh, and before I go too far, I want to make sure that this is interactive. You guys come here to learn, so if I am going too fast or too slow, or you have a question and you want me to go at a different pace or a different way, just raise your hand, yell, do something, and interrupt me. And I want you guys to get the most out of this that you possibly can for the next hour. So Groovy, and you'll hear its availability. It's available in PBCS and on-prem. It's available in 2 different flavors, and some people don't understand the difference. So on-prem, you can use Groovy or Java or Perl or probably a lot of other languages to use the REST API, and the REST API is what EPM Automate uses to automate commands, to load data, all of that stuff. The REST API actually has more functionality than EPM Automate, but if you're local or even an on-prem implementation, you can use Groovy to interact with the applications that way. So on-prem does not have Groovy calculations. So what that means is when you go into a business rule, you can change the business rule to a Groovy calculation, and then you have much more functionality than you ever had before. I'm not going to read some of these slides. Yes?
So what Essbase on-prem does, correct?
Essbase on-prem, you cannot interact in a calculation. So there's nothing on the roadmap for them to add Groovy into the calculations. I mean, Groovy's an open source language, so anybody can install it on anything and use it for whatever you want to use it for. So you can use the REST API to interact with the application, but the difference is with the cloud application, you can be much more interactive. So if a user saves a form, you can stop them from saving the form because the allocation is 100%, or the rate is a negative number, or something like that. It's not available in the business rules. So you can use it to do all other kinds of things, but you can't use it inside of a business rule. So when a user saves a form in the cloud, the Groovy calculation kicks off, and you can interact immediately with that action. That does not exist on-prem. Does that help? It's the interactive part. Yeah, you can kind of shell out a call, and you can use Groovy for custom-defined functions and things like that, but you can't read what cell is dirty. You can't read, those types of things. Yeah. So this stuff is stuff that I got straight out of the Groovy website, and I'm not going to read it. The biggest thing is that it's open source, and for me, I'm not really officially a programmer, so for me, Groovy is a lot easier than Java. There are a lot of things that might take 10 or 20 lines in Java that you can do in 1 line in Groovy. And if anybody's ever used PowerShell, I would kind of compare it to that. It's almost like trying to write a DOS application in PowerShell or a VB script application, and there are things in PowerShell that you can do in 1 or 2 lines that a VB script would be this big, right? Looping and things like that. So that's kind of how I compare it. What it means is obviously it's a little bit more friendly. It's easier to interact with. You get much more access to things like if you've ever done anything in a calculation script or a business rule where you're taking the member name and you're converting it to a string or you're concatenating and it's concat. All of those things you can actually do in Groovy and then pass it to the business rule. So there's a lot of things that are kind of slow in Essbase, like any string manipulations that you can actually do on the Groovy side and then send it to the calculation. And we'll get into that in a little bit. PBCS is built on Groovy, so it's not like this is a fad. This is kind of here to stay, at least for a while, until they rewrite PBCS. So if you're afraid that you're going to start using it and then it's going to be useless in a year, that's not going to be the case. So there are some huge benefits to this, and I don't know, was anybody in the presentation that I did a couple hours ago? A couple people? Okay. So some of this will be a little bit reiterative, but there's huge performance increases. You can do input validation. I can tell you that the implementation to a project for most of us is probably going to add time to it, and there's 2 reasons for that. One is there's a learning curve, and 2 is you're actually adding functionality that didn't exist. So just like anything else, if you got to write 10 business rules, it's going to take longer than 2. If you're adding business rules that actually do pre-save validation and optimize the calculations, it's additional functionality, and it's going to take a little bit longer. So I'm going to jump into a demonstration just to give you a little bit of a taste of this, because this, I mean, I've been doing this since probably 98, 99, something like that. So coming on 20 years, I guess. And when ASO came out, it was huge. Like, you know, no consolidations, all that stuff. That was a big, big deal. I would compare the availability of Groovy to that. And this is a very strong reason why. So if I go into this form, and this is let me change my POV. So this form, wrong form, sorry. So I'm going to change the point of view in this form to totals of a couple dimensions. So there are about 35,000 vendors in this application. So 35,000 rows in this form. It's suppressed, so obviously we don't see all of them. Just a nugget. The red cells indicate that they were overrides to seeded values in this application. So the fact that I can enter data at total order method, I have to push that data down. So it's kind of a top-down adjustment phase in this case. So every time, every line that gets executed in a calculation has to do an allocation, which takes longer than just saving data. So I want to make sure you understand that this isn't just saving data. Typically what would happen on a form like this is you would do at relative of the vendor, the ones in the rows, and you would run the calculation. So even if you only change one row and you did a save, it would do the allocation for every one of these vendors. And if you had 500 vendors or 1,000 vendors on this page, you're doing 999 more than what you need if you only change one line. So Groovy doesn't do anything magically to the Essbase engine itself, but it gives you the ability to isolate exactly what data you want to change. So if you only change January in one cell, you only have to calculate January in one vendor. If you change 10 rows, then you're going to change, obviously it's going to run on 10 rows. So I'm going to increase the growth rate or change the growth rate to, I'm going to do a big number because I want you to see the results of this. I'm going to change the unit price. So right now it's right over here at 169. I'm going to change it to 200. And I'm going to save this form. So when this executes, and I can go into the log and actually prove this, it seems like it takes a little bit longer than what you might expect, but the majority of the time, let me change the order method here. And try this one more time. All right, so we'll save this, and it'll execute. And basically what happens on this form is, one, it saves the data, it runs the allocation, it dynamically adjusts the S-base calculation to only run on that one intersection, so it was actually pretty quick. Then it dynamically uses the intersections that change to do the data push, so the smart push. Then I use Groovy to pull data from the reporting ASO cube for this application, so the channel, it's got channel, material group, and company, all the dimensions up there that aren't in the consolidated P&L. So I retrieve it from the top, and then I submit it basically to the P&L. So this is literally real-time reporting, which we've never had that ability before. So there's no consolidation of the BSO application, nothing. So if I go into a spreadsheet, and so this is RGP, this would be the ASO application that's connected to that form. So if I refresh this, you'll see data change. So you see the numbers change, okay? So if I go over to the fin cube, which doesn't have those other dimensions, it doesn't have order and delivery channel and vendor, the numbers don't validate. So there are differences in some of these. When I go over to the fin, which is the BSO cube, and I hit refresh, the numbers update. When I go to RFin and I hit refresh, so I update those retrieves. If I go over to the validation, they're all valid. So I literally changed one intersection at a very detailed level of the product, the gross profit model, and effectively consolidated that and pushed that to the P&L cube, so anybody can go look at the P&L cube and get an immediately consolidated number. So if you think about that on a workforce application, let's say I go in and I change one person from union to non-union. I hit save, I can immediately go over to the financial planning application and get my impacted results. No consolidations, nothing runs at night, users don't have to wait. Like it runs in under a second. So it's incredible what we have the power to do now. Again, it doesn't change the S-base calculation at all. All it does is say, I'm going to change the fix instead of doing I descendants, or at relative, I mean. And it changes that, and it loops through the cells in that form, and it says, I only changed 3 rows. So it basically dynamically generates the fix statement for those 3 vendors and the months that you changed, and then runs that calculation. Does that make sense? I want more people to be jumping around. You want to see the code? I'll show you the code. I will show you the code. I'm not going to keep that to myself. I'll get there in just a second. So let me talk about a few other things. The one other thing I wanted to show you is the pre-input validation. So the traffic lighting that you can do is really up to whatever you want it to do. But there's also pre-save validation, which you'll date yourself if you ever use JavaScript and on-prem before SmartView, where you could actually stop a submission of a form. We have that ability basically now, and it converts to SmartView. So if I go into this phasing adjustments, this gives me the ability, after I do an override, to smooth out my units or whatever I select, whatever account I select over the months. So you'll notice that I've got like 243 units in January over here. If I want to override that and I want to increase it by 20 and then decrease this one by 18, let's say, in this use case, they didn't want anybody to be able to change the net number, so it has to be an impact of 0. So if I click save, it's going to come back and it's going to say that there were validation errors. So this is different than what you're used to, where the form saves and a business rule checks some stuff, and then you use the @return to tell the person that they need to fix it. So the data never gets submitted to SBase or planning. So there's nothing to fix in the application. It stopped them from doing anything wrong at this point. So when you look at this, if you put your cursor over it, it highlights anything, and you can pick the color. I chose red, and you can pick the tooltip. So the tooltip right here tells you, and it's hard to read, but it basically says you have a net of +2, and that can't happen. So if I go in and change that and make this a -20 and save it, it'll save. And again, when this saves, it does all the synchronization, and I can go over to that spreadsheet that I had and look at the P&L cube and actually see the impact of this, which would be pennies probably, but it's that quick. So real-time reporting. You know, the other thing in here that we have forced is if I want to reduce this by 500 units, and I'm just giving you ideas here. When I save this, it's also going to block me because the number of units that are in that month is 263, and it's telling me that I can't have negative units. I can't sell minus cases of whatever, right? Now, real world, you might have accruals, or you might want to let somebody do that, but again, just an example. So before I get into the code, there's a couple things to realize. Groovy is available in ePBCS, and it is available in PBCS +1. And if you've never heard of that, what that means is you can buy PBCS and you can buy one module. So instead of paying the $240 or whatever it is a license, you can kind of pay in between and you can get one module, or you can get 2 pods. Both of those are considered ePBCS plus or PBCS +1, and you get Groovy with both of those. So the only time you don't get Groovy is if you just have PBCS. And I know that that stinks. I mean, it just stinks. But I'll be honest, it's from what I've been told, it's really just, it's a money thing. They want you to pay for it. So there's nothing in the roadmap for them to enable it in PBCS, unfortunately. There's also nothing in the roadmap to do it on-prem. So they have no intention of putting this on-prem. And I've talked about some of these, but I'll cover them again. So the proactive user input validation, and to me this is huge, and the client that I just came from, they had a situation where people were going into the workforce module and they were saying that the person was an hourly person, and then they were putting in a salary. And the calculation said if you're hourly, use the hourly rate. If you're salaried, use the annual salary number that you put in. So people were changing those or fat fingering it. So they put an hour, then they put a salary rate, and there was never anything in the budget for that person. So that's a huge miss. So their budget was low. So you can do validations like if you're going to make it an hourly, you got to make sure that they have an hourly rate. Otherwise, it doesn't let them save it. So the impact to the users is huge too. It's not just a nice to have. I mean, it does make a big impact. So like we talked about the proactive proactive data validation, the selective data synchronizations, and that's where basically you loop through the rows like I showed you, and it only picks up the rows that have changed in the columns. The selective business logic. You also have access to a ton of Java functions, not all of them, because I've come across some that don't work. But you have the ability to do all kinds of things with Groovy and Java that you never had access to do before. And you have math, you have string functions, you have replace functions, and there's all kinds of stuff that I'm learning because I don't have a Groovy or a Java background. There's all kinds of things that I'm learning that you can do that I never even knew were possible. So tons of opportunities. You got the real-time consolidated reporting, which I talked about. So check this out for those of you who have done this a while. Who in here would have ever imagined that you would use SBase and never write an SBase calculation? Anybody ever think of that? Maybe? Yeah, one. So think about this. You can put all your forms on top of an ASO application, and you can do all your logic in Groovy. You eliminate the data push. You eliminate consolidations altogether. Holy crap. I never not that I think about it when I go to bed at night, but I never would have thought that I would build an SBase application or a planning application and not use business rules or effectively not use calculations, not use I-descendants and fixed statements and all that type of stuff. But we actually have a client that we did that, and we built everything in Groovy, and it sits on top of ASO. So currency exchange rates, I mean, the whole gamut, all inside of ASO. So I think that's crazy. The traffic lighting, you have complete control over colors, how it's traffic lighted, so it's not just the validation stuff that they have in the forms. It goes way beyond that. The custom user error, so you can create an object where you can have multiple languages, so you can have an error in 10 languages, so whatever the person who, however they're signed in with whatever their locale is, it'll use that language. And then the custom logging, and I'll show you some of the logs. So basically in the log, there's nothing. If you write a Groovy calculation and run it, there's nothing in the log. It's up to you as to what you want to put. So you can put, hey, I started the push this time, the push finished at this time, the S-base calculation finished at this time. It was Jane that ran the calculation. Here's the time that she ran. I mean, anything that you want to put in there, you can put in there. And then if you use strategic modeling, the old or the new HSF in the cloud, which I never have, but there's all kinds of interactions. So you can actually update HSF and it'll automatically push to planning and vice versa. So I think if I ever implemented HSF, that would be a huge, or strategic modeling, sorry, that would be a huge thing. So we talked about the performance improvements, and this is just kind of a benchmark. This is just a benchmark. The client that I implemented this at, here's kind of what it was pre and post Groovy. So 26 seconds on the calculation went down to 0.3 seconds. 1 second on the smart push from 15 seconds. And then the consolidation to do the push, to do the X writes, was 83 seconds, so a minute and a half every time somebody saved the form, and that's down to 0.2 seconds. So it was really the difference between success and failure at this client. You can also do loops, so you can query metadata. So I can say for every company, I want to run an execution, a data map, or whatever. So the global consolidations that you typically run at night or midday to catch currency rate changes and anything where a business rule might have failed on the form, that went from 663 seconds, which if my math is right, divided by 60, it's 6-7 minutes, right? And it went down to 12 seconds. So the full effectively the consolidation and the push for everything takes 12 seconds. And I always get the question, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, it does depend on the number of rows that you pick. So if you updated every row on the form, it's going to be really no different than doing descendant, or at relative. But how many times does a user go in and change every single row? It's probably not that often. Especially in workforce where they're tweaking people and adding people. So the one thing that doesn't change on this grid is the push to the fin model. So the effectively removing the consolidation, we're doing that at a high level whether you change one vendor or all the vendors because you're doing total vendor. So it makes no difference if you change 1,000 of them or one of them. So the 0.2 seconds that we saw is going to be 0.2 seconds whether you change every single vendor or one vendor. And if you haven't kind of come to this conclusion, who should consider Groovy? I literally can go into any implementation, and I'm not going to read this directly, but if you're on-prem and you've got complex modeling, even if you're on-prem, I think you should upgrade, but there's all kinds of things. I mean, anybody that has consolidation timing issues, anybody that wants to do pre-save validation will benefit from this, whether you're on-prem or whether you have an existing implementation that's in the cloud. If you start using Groovy, you're going to get significant savings on a lot of this stuff. So, learning curve. This is a guy I work with. We're a leverage model, so we hire them young. And what I would say is, again, I'm not a programmer by trade. I mean, I've learned it because it's helped me be productive and solve solutions that, or solve problems for the things that I've come across. So anybody that has some vision, has some creativity, that can understand the business to be able to have some foresight as to what they're going to encounter, like the issue with if you change the person from salary to hourly, hey, what if they don't change the rate? Then it's going to be blank. All of those things, right? I mean, if you have the vision to kind of see those things, then you'll do fine. I mean, anybody can learn Groovy. The API is documented. It takes a little while, but There's a lot of stuff on my blog about how to start with this and how to do this. So I did it, and like I said, I took 0 classes on programming, so I figured it out. What I will tell you is that if you start doing this, and especially if you don't have a Groovy background or a Java background, there's going to be 3 aspects that I think you need to focus on. One is there's all these APIs you can use. So the application programming interface. So basically PBCS makes available all of these calls that you can do. Then there's the knowledge around Groovy, right? And then how those work together. So I knew nothing about Groovy. I could look at the API and I could understand what they do and kind of how I had to use it, but I would come across things like they would be documented to say get POV, and I would see an example from a coworker that just had POV. And I'd say, why didn't you do get POV? Because get POV doesn't work, but POV works. How did you do that? And they'd say, well, that's Groovy. I mean, if you know how Groovy works, then you know that's an object and you don't need to use get if you don't put the parentheses at the end. Like, hell, I don't know that. How do you know that? How did you learn that? And they're like, well, it's Groovy. If you knew Groovy, you'd know that. And I'm like, well, I don't know Groovy. So there's a lot of things like that. So if you start using this and get stuck, try to figure out, is it the API that you don't understand, or is it Groovy and using the API that you don't understand? And most likely it's going to be the Groovy side of it. Just a quick note on the application that I'm demoing. It's actually twice as big as the application that the client that I built this from. And the reason why is because I made it generic and I removed all of their products and names and things like that. And then I thought, I'm going to use the REST API to download a bunch of stuff from Best Buy's website, which you can actually do. So I wanted to learn that and figure that out. So I started doing that, and then I embedded that into here. So I actually have 2 product hierarchies, and all the data is duplicated, although I'm only showing you like 1/2 of it. But from a performance perspective, it's actually twice as big as a real implementation. And if you're ever curious, if you ever need data, like dummy data for examples or for POCs, and Amazon has it, I just picked Best Buy because I was curious. You can actually go out, and the REST API, it's a URL, so it's a query basically, and you can dump it out in XML. So you can go get every store, the location, how many, all the products that are in that store, inventory levels, whether they have open box items. I mean, it's almost like proprietary information. I don't know why they give it to you, but you can literally go out and query that and pull anything you want from Best Buy's, real-time Best Buy's website, as long as you don't do more than 30,000 hits a day or something like that. So the data's been altered, but the point is that I want to make sure that you guys understand that it's actually a real application, and the size is actually twice as big as what it was implemented. So we talked about this. This is kind of a comparison of the real-time reporting with Groovy and without Groovy. So the mapping that happens is the BSO, and I'll use Workforce as an example. So you have the BSO in Workforce on save. It pushes it to the ASO Workforce reporting cube, and then at that point it queries it from the ASO at the top of all the dimensions like union and employee and job description and all those dimensions that aren't in your P&L, and it retrieves it, and then it pushes it or submits it into the P&L. So you've got S-based calculations and pushes going from this right here to the ASO, and then ASO is going to these two. Make sense? The other aspect of what I talked about was the grids, and I'm going to skip this slide because we've kind of talked about some of this, and I know that you want to get into some of the calculations. So I am going to. I thought I had a slide with this, but we'll open up one of the rules since you asked, and I will show you the rule that gets executed on that overrides form. And there's actually 2 of them that we'll walk through. And I don't want to spend way too much time on this, so I'm going to go through it quick. Is it too small? Is that what you're saying, too small? All right. That better? Okay. So again, I'm going to go through this really quick. If you guys want copies of this, I'll be more than happy to send it to you. A lot of this is actually already out on my blog, but if you come up and drop a piece of paper off with your email, I'll just send people anything that we talk about today. So nothing here is a secret or confidential. And I apologize for not having it in the slide. I thought I did. So basically what I'm doing is I'm creating a string, a variable, that I'm going to hold the S-base calculation in. Up here, I'm creating variables for the point of views and the vendors and things like that, okay? So I start this string builder, and this is all just S-base calculation stuff. This is basically copied right from a business rule, okay? So I'm starting and I'm creating some variables here. Again, S-base, this is just S-base stuff. I close off that string, and now I'm iterating through each cell, and I'm actually only iterating through the cells that have changed. Yep. I'm sorry. Cells that changed. Yeah, it's only the cells that changed. Yep. So basically what happens is I'm looping through all the cells that changed, and I'm creating a variable that has a delimited list of the vendors, which is exactly what you would use if you were going to write a hard-coded S-base calculation for those 3 vendors, right? That's all this is doing. So I'm basically taking a business rule that I already created that I know works, and I've removed the I don't know why I keep saying I descendants, the at relative, and I've replaced it with the variables that are pulling from the point of view and from the rows. Nothing special about that. I mean, like I said, this doesn't make S-base faster. It doesn't make the engine any faster. You're just isolating, dynamically generating an S-base calculation on the fly so that you're only calculating what you need. That's really it. And if anybody doesn't understand that or has a question, you're more than welcome to ask me now, but I don't want to make it complicated because it's literally that simple.
Is it faster this way than the normal traditional way we pass the form point of views in the curly bracket? You pass the form point of views available to your account and you run it there?
It is. And now if I edited every row, it'd probably be the same. Or at least directionally it would be the same. But when you do that, you're saying you're doing all the rows.
That's the problem, because there's a thing called members, and it never works. You can pass single point of view members to the calculation, but as soon as you have your point pass your row,
Right.
to it.
Rows and columns. So you can even do it with the columns too. If you only change 2 months, only calculate the 2 months. Yep.
So here you're generating one fix that has a cross joint of all of the members changing one dimension, the member changing another dimension, or you're generating one fix for each cell?
I'm not creating in this calculation, I might be doing it by row because there were some algorithms that we had to create. But in general, if you were going to use I descendants, I wouldn't create one for each separate row. I would just, instead of the I descendants, I would just have vendor 1, vendor 2, vendor 3, vendor 4. That's it. So again, all I'm doing is I'm just getting the point of views to pass to the business rule. So when I look at the business rule, here's my fixed statement. I've got my scenario, my company, my year, my months. This header is actually the vendors. So that's the delimited list of vendors. Yep.
If you have the sparse dimension in the rows, did you see the impact? Or if you see the dense dimension in the row, did you see the impact?
On the calculation performance, or?
Yeah. Because you're using Groovy, right? You're selecting certain cells.
Yeah, I don't.
When it comes to the play of a dense dimension versus sparse.
The refresh of the form might change a little bit depending on your dense sparse settings, but I don't think the calculation would change a whole lot.
Well, the performance of the calc.
I don't think it would. I mean, it wouldn't change any more than it would if you did it the traditional way.
True.
Yeah.
The improvement you'll not see, right? If it's a dense.
Oh, if you're filtering on dense. So, yes. I mean, minimal, right? Like months, period, is dense usually.
Yeah.
So, yes, you wouldn't see a difference, but you will see a difference on the data push, on the smart push.
Sparse.
So you still get an improvement, yeah, on that. So you think about 12 months, if you only change 2, you just decrease the amount of data by, you know, what, a sixth, down to a sixth of what it was. So, yep. So again, the rest of this is just an S-based calc. All I'm doing is replacing what you would have as the at relative and the point of view, and I'm just replacing the variables that I created by looping through the cells to figure out which one's changed. So very simple. And this one actually is the first one I did, and this probably makes the most impact originally by, you know, skinning that down and only calculating the specific rows. So this right here is one of the easiest things you'll do. Yes, sir? Yeah. Let me open up a different one that's a little bit less complex. So I'll open up the calculation that we did that had the 12 months and the spreading. So it's this right here. It is, by default, it's right here. So you could do it a couple different ways. I actually don't like this way. This was earlier when I was learning, but you can actually say if the cell equals data, like dot data changed or something, and I'll give a better example when I get into a calc. But yeah, it's right here. So if you don't have anything here, then you're not iterating through, or you're iterating through everything. So I asked actually the product development earlier today about that because I haven't seen a way to do it, and you actually can. So they're going to send me an example, and then I'll post it on the blog. But yeah, you can actually get the old value.
Is there any settings that we need to invoke the Groovy, or it comes with a
It's there, yeah. You change this to edit, and then you go over here to the right, and you change calculation to Groovy. Yep. So at the end of this, after I build all of this logic, at the end of this, I'm just returning that string. And then the S-based calculation executes. So I'm just dynamically generating a string that's a valid S-based calculation and then returning it. Nothing crazy.
And then you link this calc script back to the root?
Yeah, so on save, it executes, yep. Yep. Like I said, this one is about as simple as you can possibly get. You just take what you did in a business rule and you put the parameters in it. So, and let me show you something a little bit simpler on the looping that I think will help. I'm going to try to find one that I wrote the other way that looks more logical. Here. It was harder to see in the other screen, but I'm basically saying looping through all the cells where the cell is edited. Okay? And this is the way I prefer to write it because it's more readable when I look at it. So again, if you take this out, it's going to loop through every cell.
You basically creating the array of vendors, since there's 10 vendors, what you basically do is you're not passing it one to the script, you're creating an array of the vendors, and you're passing that. Or we can pass it one.
There's a couple ways you can do it. So this, I'm adding this to an array or a list or a collection in Groovy. And then, yeah, further down, actually right here, I'm actually splitting that out and doing it comma delimited with quotes around each one, so it, so if there's a space or it's only a number or, whatever. Good practice to put quotes around your member names and your strings and your calculations. Yep.
How do you debug these things? How you can put breaks and see what's the outcome?
Good question. So what I have done, and I've probably commented a lot of this out, anytime you put a print line, PRINTLN, you can just put whatever you want. And you can use how many cells got edited, like this vendor list. So if I go over, let me see if I have one that I can show you. So this is the override calculation, and again, everything here I've requested to get sent to this log, otherwise it'd be blank. So if you scroll down through here, these are the calculations. This is the calculations actually getting sent to the SBase script, and that's really all I sent to this one. Let me find a different one. I have a screenshot of one in a slide. I'll show you. It's better, and we won't waste any time digging around. So we talked about the validations, we talked about the traffic lighting, and again, the traffic lighting, you can do whatever you want. So I've put stuff in here where I actually said if there's a threshold, so if I put in a rate that's above 30%, rather than saying you can't enter that, you force the person to put in a cell note and explain it. Now, they could, put nothing into the cell note, right? You can't force that, but basically if you're gonna go above or below a certain threshold, you're gonna have to put a comment in. And then it'll save. So if it's above the threshold and there's a comment there, it'll save. So even things like that, the possibilities are endless. They really are.
So if you change your value to a pound missing,
Mm-hmm.
and if you try to push it to the ASO,
Mm-hmm.
does it do anything?
It does not, but I have an example of how to get around that. So we have 15 minutes left, right, Mr. Moderator? All right. So we've talked about the traffic lighting. I'm not going to jump into a bunch of detail on that, but the code to do that is in here. I've got a screenshot of that. It's very simple. You're just checking one cell to another, or is it above a number, or whatever. You could actually even pull in, you could query and say if the member has a UDA of allow bigger number, then if it has the bigger number, let it go. If it doesn't have that UDA and it has a bigger number, then block it from being saved. Those are the types of things you can do. And again, I'm just throwing stuff out just to give you some ideas of how open this is. The dynamic SBase calcs, this is what we were talking about, and this kind of lays out what what I was describing. Whereas without Groovy, you're taking all the rows and all the columns. With Groovy, you're only taking over here in the green, so you're only taking the cells that relate to the columns and rows that have been changed. Here is, so I do have a sample calculation. It was just further along than what I thought. So here's an example. So right here is the grid iterator, and it goes through the edited cells. Then it loops through, and in this case, in this example, I basically create a periods and a products variable, and then I'm putting any period or product that's changed, so I'm creating that list of what I need to do the push and the calculations. And then an example fixed statement where I'm actually using, the comma delimited string with the quotes around each member. Data maps. Data maps, smart pushes, they're all kind of the same thing. So you can actually execute those in Groovy, and here's an example, and I'm not going to specifically go through one example where I go through and save, because you guys have all seen it 2 or 3 times already. But this is an example. I'm doing the same thing up here. I'm getting the point of views, right? I'm looping through and getting the vendors that changed. And then down here is where I'm actually passing the parameters that you would in a smart push, the overrides. And people have asked me, would you rather have a smart push on a form or would you rather use a data map? Because the data maps, you have to define everything. And then a smart push, you would only define the things that you want to override. So theoretically, I'd only have to pass, in this case, vendor and month, because those are the only two things that are going to be changed based on looping through the edited cells. I personally like to do the data maps because I like to see it in here. I like to actually see in one place what point of view I'm actually pushing. And my fear is, especially when I go to clients, if they see a smart push on a form that's set to never run, they might think it's not needed and delete it, and then this wouldn't work. So I've always been kind of hesitant to do that. So I try to use smart or data maps as much as I can. So the grid builders are the piece that we talked about where I'm retrieving from the ASO and then submitting to another ASO or a BSO. These are probably the most complicated thing that you will deal with, and everything that I've done from a validation perspective or a testing perspective, I've put comments inside of the calculations and I send them out. So if it's breaking, it'll tell you what line it broke at in the log. I'll send got to 1, got to 2, got to 3, and there are things that you can push out to those logs to debug it, but there's no stepping through it. The grid builders, I think, are probably the most difficult part because you think you have a point of view, and how many people in here have been testing an S-based calculation and spent 4 hours and they're like, it's not working, and then you realize you have the wrong point of view? I think everybody in here has probably done that. It's the same concept with this. So you can loop through the grid and spit that out to the log. So when I have something where I think it should work, it's not erring, it's just the data's not getting to where I think it should get to. I loop through the cells in the grid builder and I push out the from, and the data's there, so I know that the data is right on the source. I got the right point of view, and then I do the same thing when I submit it. I loop through that grid to make sure that that one has the data, and every time that I've come across an issue, it's become my point of view was wrong. I was using a point of view from a header instead of a hard-coded value of like input for the source or something. So basically, to answer your question, you just loop through and you write out to the log. And I write it out as a delimited string. So I actually have something, and I just copy it and I paste it into Excel, and I basically get my SmartView retrieve, right? I get the headers, the POV, and then the headers and the rows and the numbers, and they're all delimited. So when you paste it into Excel, it parses it out, and you can look at it just like you would if you created a SmartView. And that's been very helpful for me. One thing that I will tell you that you guys will probably run into, I don't know, you may have run into it already with smart pushes, is the smart push assumes the security of the user. So if you have a rate times a volume, and let's say the revenue is getting calculated and they don't have write access to the revenue, when you do a smart push, it doesn't push the revenue. So it'll push the rate and it'll push the volume, but it won't push the revenue, which to me is a huge issue. We've gotten around it by making the lines, gray or making them read only so the user has write access, but you kind of parse out the rows in the form so that they're read only, which is a pain in the butt to do, and it's not the right way to do it. The grid builder has the exact same problem. So the grid builder will only write to what the user has write access to. So that's to me a significant issue that's a pain to work around. The development team is actually bouncing ideas off internally about how they're going to handle that. They recognize that it's a problem and they're working on it. They just don't know exactly which way they're going to go to solve it. My point was just add a parameter. So the read data grid has a parameter whether you want to use the admin ID or the security of the user. Why not have that on the right one? It seems simple to me, but I'm sure that writing that code at that level on a product this size is more complicated than anything I've ever done. So the grid builder, if anybody's going to be here tomorrow, I was actually asked to do a deep dive on just the grid builder. So I think I've got about 30 minutes to talk about the grid builder. And I'm going to have code examples and everything. And you guys, if you're not here, you don't want to go to it, but you want it, you can go and download it from the ODTUG website. I have the presentations out there. So anyway, if you're interested in that, it might be something that you want to go to. So the customized logs, usually what I submit to the logs are the point of view, the rows, the columns, all the things that I think would be valuable in debugging a process. So this is just an example. It's a little bit small, but you'll see in here that I've got times. So I'm basically pushing times out for every process and how long each process takes. I've got the vendors in here. So these were the rows that I had edited. So I know which vendors were identified that needed to be pushed. I've got the POV over here, so I know what POV I'm using. I've got the row headers. I've got the column headers and the data. Or in this case, I don't have the data, but you see, like, this is all delimited, so you can kind of copy this and paste it. If you write it in the right order, you can just paste it into a spreadsheet, and you would have it split out. Make sense? This is another one that's a little bit more detailed, and it's a little bit hard to read, but you guys can download it. This has a little bit more in here about the times, but again, it's just another example. Runtime prompts. So runtime prompts are something that I think is missed in this process, in the Groovy. And rather than go through, I'm just going to show you an example. So I have a calculation, a rule that the administrator might want to run. Oops. So this process is a global process that does the currency, it does the data pushes and all of that kind of stuff. So when I execute this, it actually comes up and asks me, do you want to do the push of the data from RGP to FIN? So if there's no reason to do the currency conversion, it's already been pushed. So this is the longest aspect of it, but it gives the admin the ability to either select they want to do it or they don't want to do it, right? You've got typical things like your year and your scenario, and then whether you want to clear the data on the push or not. And if you think about this, on all the forms that I've done for this client, I actually have a very simple Groovy script that says if nothing's been edited on the cell, just prompt the user that they haven't changed anything and then exit. So you're not running rules for no reason. I think it's just cleaner. And I mean, there's so many things that you can do. If there's going to be like for instance, on one of the forms, you can reset all of the data. So if you change a bunch of your overrides and if I change a bunch of these overrides and I want to go back to the original seeded amounts, I can right click and go up to reset, so I can reset the selected product or all products. And if I do this, it comes up and says, whoa, 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 are you sure you want to do this? This is going to clear everything and reset you back. So not that they won't ignore it if they get used to always changing it to yes, but it is, it is a smack in the face or, flick of the nose to say, all right, last chance. It doesn't just do it and they go, oh crap, I didn't mean to do that. So there's all kinds of things like that you can do with runtime prompts now. Like I said, cancel calculations, warn people of things. There's tons of stuff. There's all types of validations. If you need a phone number, you can make sure it's formatted as a phone number. And if it doesn't have 9 digits for the US, then it doesn't allow you to continue. So tons of stuff that you can do. This is an example of the runtime prompt. So this is the one of the admin. So I'm asking, do you want to push? Do you want to clear? And then, the name and et cetera. So the example down here below is one that says, if you're going to enter a person's name, like on the workforce model, I don't want any special characters. So it has to be just numbers and letters. We've talked about the form validation. We've gone through examples of that, so I don't think there's anything more that we would need to go through there. There's some screenshots of some of the examples that we went through, and there's code in there as examples as well. So if you download it, you'll have that. So there's more, but we've talked about some of this. Localized messages, querying metadata. That's actually been a huge nice to have to be able to query the metadata. Should it be? Is it a product that should have a currency conversion? Is it like there's all kinds of things that I've actually used that for. Smart.
Any limitations on the properties
Not that I've run into yet. So if you say I want the member properties, it returns a map, and it's got everything that you get like an LCM. Smart list integration. This is another really cool thing. So in PBCS, you can have a smart list connected to a dimension. So if you want to do a transfer from A to B, you can have a smart list to say, I want to go from wherever my point of view is to B. And if B is the same as A, I don't want to do anything, so you could stop that from happening. But you can get the string, you can get the numeric value that the POV represents. So, you know, before this, you would just get the S-base value, right? The numeric value that however many you added, right? But now you can actually get the string. So if you're doing a calculation where you're copying from member A to member B, you actually have the member name, which is actually kind of nice. So on our transfers, we actually did that in the workforce model. So you can't fat finger it, you can't type it in wrong. That's a nice thing. The clearing the ASO, which somebody mentioned, and again, that example is in the demonstration that I'm going to do tomorrow. So you can download that presentation, but yes, you can clear an ASO cube. And the specific example that I have is when you're right-clicking and you're deleting an employee, like a to be hired, and then you do the ASO push, it doesn't push anything because the block's gone. So I have an example about how to clear out the data on the ASO side for that. We've hit on most of these things. Growing pains, there are still some issues with it. It's better than it was 6-8 months ago. It was released in June of last year, so it's been out a year now, I guess. And it's actually pretty stable. The biggest thing for me is just the issue with the validations not working in SmartView. That's the biggest one that I run across that's kind of a pain in the butt. The Groovy documentation, you will find that there are methods out there that they say you have access to that you don't. So if you ever are trying to use a method like the one, like get substitution variable, or not substitution variable, get a subvar. There's a parameter or a method out there to get the substitution variable for current month, and you know all those things that you typically get, it doesn't work. And I spent 2 days trying to get it to work, and then development finally came back and said, yeah, that shouldn't be in the documentation. You don't have access to that. We haven't exposed that one to you. Like, that one's a pretty important one to expose, but so if you ever run into that, that might be something you want to do before you spin your wheels, is to open up a ticket and see if you even have access to it. I have a thing in here about working with support. We all know the challenges of working with Oracle, and it's up to you to get an answer from Oracle. I've worked with a lot of different reps, and I've kind of consolidated a list of things of how to get answers. And I'm not promising that it'll work, but the squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? So call them every day, escalate to a duty manager, escalate it to the US. I mean, there's all kinds of things, and here's some helpful things that might help you get something a little bit quicker. There's some information here, and I've hit on most of these. Undocumented fines. If you know anything about Groovy or Java, you like to run things with a closable tag at the end of it, and I'm still kind of understanding what that actually means, but if you ever use the grid builder, use with closable at the end because it basically releases the memory right away. And if you start using a ton of grid builders, then you're going to consume a bunch of memory that's just wasted. Resources, this is a list of places that I go to frequently, but there's hundreds of others that I've gone to that I found in Google. I've got a whole bunch of articles from like just creating a calculation to the grid builders and everything else. I have probably 20 or 30 in my head in a list that I want to do to share how I've done some of this stuff. So the development team actually, so this is pretty cool. The development team actually told me to send anything I post to them and they'll make sure it's right because they're sending everybody to my website to learn. So if there's any validity in what I have out there, it's actually going through development most of the time. So hopefully it's valuable to you guys. So that's it. Again, fill out your survey on your way out, and if you go to intohyperion.com, that's where all of this stuff is. I'll post this when it's available, so I'm recording it, and I'll produce that, and I'll stick that out there if you want to listen to it again, or if somebody that wasn't here, if you want them to listen to it, it'll be available. I'll post all my presentations out on Into Hyperion as well, even though you'll be able to get them through the OD Tug site. So that's it. Like I said, we are 3 minutes late, so I think we're okay. If you guys have any questions, you can ask them now, or you can come up here and one-on-one. I have nowhere to be until, 7 o'clock is when the thing is tonight? 6:30? Thank you. I would have missed it. So like I said, we can go out in the hall and I can answer any questions you guys have or show you something, whatever. So hope it was valuable, and thank you for attending.